Welcome to the Affirming Minds podcast, where we equip like-minded mental health professionals with a therapeutic toolkit that helps add to a more engaging, fulfilled, and effective mental health practice. Each empowering episode can stand alone as a continuing education pod course or a very valuable professional or personal resource with insightful expert interviews, practical resources, industry news, and lots of inspiration. We help the modern therapist thrive at work. Now let's welcome your host, a dedicated therapist and passionate educator, Shayna Cyber, LCSW.
Welcome to the Affirming Minds podcast. I'm your host, Shayna Cyber. Today's episode is eligible for continuing education credit. To earn credit, visit affirmmentalhealth.com and join our membership, where you'll get CE access for our podcast episode, plus workshops, self-study courses, and so much more. If you're already an Affirm Academy member, simply log in through the portal or use the link in the show notes to access the post-test and evaluation. Once you complete it, your CE certificate will be emailed to you within minutes. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave a 5-star review and comment on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps other listeners find the show and join our affirming community of learners. A quick reminder before we begin, this podcast is for educational purposes only. If you're in need of mental health treatment or clinical supervision, please reach out to a licensed professional in your area. All cases and client stories described in this episode are de-identified, vignette-based, or composite, and no protected health information is ever shared. Today's guest is Alyce Messer, LCSW, an EMDRIA-Approved consultant, IFS Level 2 trained therapist, and someone whose work sits right at the intersections of internal family systems and attachment theory. One thing I love about Alyce and why I've been so excited to have her on is her passion for illuminating the overlap between attachment and the IFS model. It's a framing that isn't talked about enough, and I think it has enormous clinical applicability. When you understand how early attachment adaptations become protectors and how self-energy functions as an internal secure base, the entire model really comes alive in a new way. And for me specifically, and I hope that you feel that way too. If you're newer to IFS or you want a structural primer before we dive into the deeper layers today, I recommend listening to episode 35 of the Affirming Minds podcast with Kendall Hart. The episode lays out the core foundations: self-energy, managers, firefighters, exiles, blending and unblending. Today, we're going to build on that groundwork, moving from what is the model into why does our internal system form the way that it does. Before we get into that conversation, I am thrilled to share that Alyce will be teaching a full introduction to internal family systems therapy or Affirm Mental Health. We'll be doing a live workshop on February 24th, 2026, from 12 to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're going to be offering 3 continuing education credits through ASWB, NBCC, New York State Department of Education for social workers and psychologists, offering this on Zoom so we can reach folks across the country and beyond. The cost is $60, which is incredibly affordable, especially how in-demand trainings on internal family systems are. But even better, if you're a Affirm Academy member, you already know this is included in your membership. And what's more, this workshop is part of Affirm Reads, our CE-eligible book club for therapists, where clinicians read a foundational text and then join a live training or a paired learning opportunity to integrate it into their practice. For this training, we're reading No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz, the developer of IFS. And this is the essential book explaining the IFS model and the idea that every part of us, no matter how extreme, was developed in some way, typically to protect us. And I think this will really be a wonderful pairing to this training. Again, included for Affirm Academy members. You do have to independently borrow or buy the book, but the CE opportunity associated with it is included for our members. Never been a better time to join the Affirm Academy, but you can also just join us for this live workshop and do the add-on for the Affirm learning opportunity if you prefer that. So I'm going to do a really quick overview of both models, just for those of you who may not be as familiar. Internal family systems, or IFS, views the mind as an inner ecosystem of parts. Some of these parts are described as managers that try to manage or through trying to control or prevent unwanted internal emotional experiences. Firefighters react when the distress usually inevitably breaks through. And exiles are the parts of oneself that feel really intolerable, that we tend to push away, or can also represent unmet needs. These can show up for different ways in different people. But at the center of this model is also this concept of self energy, which is our inherent capacity for clarity, compassion, confidence, curiosity, calm. And healing occurs when we unblend from the protectors, access self, and create secure internal attachment with our parts. So it's a really interesting and beautiful model. And what Alyce really pairs it with today is attachment theory, which describes how our early caregiving shapes our expectations of safety, attunement, and what happens when we need something. Because attachment is so critical and proximity equals survival, attachment, style, and behaviors lead to lifelong adaptations designed to maintain closeness or minimize threat that show up in all different spaces in our lives. So, Alyce really walks us through the synergy between these two theoretical frames. And so this is really where Alyce's work shines. She helps make visible the developmental roots of our heart, how protectors are essentially attachment adaptations in disguise. Understanding this connection not only deepens IFS work, it brings exceptional clarity to trauma treatment, relationship dynamics. So it's a really rich, layered conversation that brings the IFS map and attachment theory into a shared, coherent frame. I was so grateful to have Alyce on to talk me through it. So let's get into it. Alyce, thank you so much for being here today on the Affirming Minds podcast. I'm just so honored to have you and to really get into this really interesting discussion about internally family systems today. So maybe could you just start us off by introducing yourself and sharing how you got involved in this work?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Shayna. I'm so excited to be here. This is my first podcast experience, so I'm very excited.
Extra.
Yes, absolutely. So my name is Alyce Messer. I'm a therapist in Arlington, Texas, but my work has really expanded to I do a lot of trainings, a lot of consultation. I'm an EMDRIA-approved consultant with helping therapists with EMDR. I specialize in assisting Kendall Hart in presenting her integration trainings, her IFS and EMDR integration trainings. And I was EMDR trained in 2017, and I was introduced to IFS in 2020. And I immediately just saw that they would partner really well together. And I especially became interested in IFS when I became a mother. I had my first child and I was like, oh, I really want to be a good parent. So I started reading stuff by Dan Siegel. I started listening to Dr. Becky, the parent whisperer, Dr. Becky Kennedy. And everything said, in order to be a mindful parent, you have to get curious about your own experience. So I always say, spoiler alert, before you could be a good parent, you have to parent yourself. So in regards to IFS, that really led me down this path of IFS. I started recognizing that when you get into the why of why you parent the way you do, those are your exiles. And then when you get into the how, you're meeting your protectors. And so everything felt like it just came together in a really cohesive way. And I started my journey learning everything I could, digesting everything I could about IFS.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. I love that you came to this through the lens of, wanting to show up as a really effective and loving parent, and then just recognizing that sort of piece of, okay, we have to be able to do that for ourselves too. I think that's a really helpful stance. You mentioned working and collaborating with Kendall Hart. For folks who are brand new to IFS, first of all, just a little bit of a promo. Alyce will be doing an introductory course to IFS coming in early 2026 that we're so thrilled about. So please stay tuned for that. We're going to drop that information in the show notes so people can join us, register. Super excited about it. It's really something our community has been asking for. Also, Kendall Hart, who you were mentioning you collaborate with, did an amazing podcast with us going over some of the foundations of IFS. So feel free to go back and check that out. I think that's also a great primer for the discussion we're going to have today. But just for those folks who are they're invested, they want to hear about IFS and attachment, can you maybe just describe the overlap between IFS and attachment in simple terms that might help it click for people?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think my hope, I obviously I don't have the ability to explain the entirety of IFS, but what I'm reminding people is that we have our protective parts, the parts that do things to prevent the exiled parts that hold the core wounds from being triggered. So we have proactive protectors that we call managers. We have reactive protectors that we call firefighters. And in addition to all of these parts, we all have this inherent self energy that exists within all of us. It doesn't have to be cultivated. And it's this grounded place in our nervous system where we're calm, connected, and we feel safe. So that is just like a 15-second overview of IFS. And then I think it's also really important to highlight what we mean by attachment. So human babies are the most fragile, vulnerable species to come into the world and are the most incapable of functioning without their primary attachment figures. So if you really think about it, our survival is dependent on attachment. So the stakes are pretty high there. So generally, we think about the amount of time we need food, shelter, and safety from our parents. I know me personally, I moved back in with my parents for grad school. So I was in my late 20s before I wasn't depending on my parents for at least shelter. So for human babies, again, attachment equals survival. And we start as an almost blank slate when we come into the world. We come in, we don't have any models in place for how we operate in the world. And then even as early as right immediately when we're born, we start noticing and creating adaptations around proximity. So what keeps my caregiver close to me? What causes there to be distance? And what brings delight? What causes smiles, like upturned mouth, soft eyes? And then what causes rejection? We start making adaptations around these observations the second we're born, in those early weeks of life. Our relationship with those observations or what turn into adaptations for attachment. And I refer to these adaptations as the formation of our most prevalent parts. So I'm going to turn up the behaviors that bring my caregiver closer. And there's no moral meaning attached to this. So it's not about good or bad. It's just what promotes proximity. What
Right, works. Yeah. What
Yeah,
is
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and the behaviors that increase proximity and delight are going to be the strategies of my most prevalent protectors. Gabor Mate, which I hope I say his name because I know that is so important to him, and I concur. He says that children's two greatest needs are to be authentic and to be attached. And this is also in Frank Anderson's book, Transcending Trauma. More often than not, a child will exile their authenticity in favor of attachment. And I learned from Dr. Becky Kennedy, by the time we are 3 years old, we are already 75% hardwired for attachment. So and I mean, with neuroplasticity, we're always capable of changing, but that's pretty huge at 3 years old, we're already 75% hardwired for what keeps us alive.
Yeah. And I think it's a really important thing that we need to think about because a lot of times we're talking about a lot of the work I do is in compassion focused therapy that does have an attachment theory through line that really helps us understand it. And we're talking about the complexity of our brain and these old systems of the brain and new systems of the brain. But a lot of times we're talking about how we're so similar to the survival functioning, these limbic systems of a reptilian brain, like all of our ephemeral frontal parts, mammal and otherwise, and just in these survival instincts. But you bringing up that piece about the uniqueness of the human experience of our prolonged dependency, and I would say our ongoing and persevering interdependency on other people to survive. I think there is a real uniqueness to the human experience and I love just my algorithm can get so dark sometimes. So I'm trying to sometimes reset it by being like, let me see like baby animal videos. And you have that thing of, okay, like these giraffes are being born into the world and they can immediately walk. And all of these high functioning mammals, like pretty quickly, they have to be able to have, of course, there is some dependency, but their maturation for independence happens at an accelerated rate. And I think what makes us unique and special as humans is that period of development in relation. But yeah, really thinking about how attachment is so central and so critical to our human experience in a way I think that we scientifically know, but it's not always has not historically been centered in our clinical intervention. So I love that you're making this marriage happen.
Yes, yes. Okay, first of all, it is very on brand for me to name yourself energy, that you have the clarity to know that when you get to a darker place, that looking at those baby animal videos like grounds you back into your self energy. So I just wanted to notice that because that's very on brand for me. And you're exactly right. I love that you have that example of a giraffe. And I think that we don't even take into consideration how long that attachment with our primary caregivers impacts us. For example, when I was 16 years old, I remember, or 14, 15, 16 years old, I remember thinking it was so cool that I was allowed to have friends spend the night on a school night. I was like, "Oh my gosh, I feel so independent." And I was operating in the world with this adult mentality. And now at 41, I'm looking back and I'm like, "Dang, she needed to be parented. She did not." I thought it was so cool to have that freedom. And I was like, I was doing things, I was having conversations within my own head that were not developmentally appropriate. And I adore my parents. I love my parents. They're my best friend. But we all do the best we can with what we have. So I think that there's a lot to be said around this ongoing need for attachment and safety and a well-resourced adult in our lives before we have a fully formed brain at 25 years old, 24, 25 years old. So yeah, I just want to
Yeah.
piggyback.
Yeah. And going back to what you were saying about your own experience of embodiment of like how do we become that well-resourced adult as well and that well-resourced caregiver. So can you talk us through when you're working with clients, how do you notice attachment themes showing up within these internal systems?
Yes, absolutely. And I want to give you an example of a child. This would be a perfect example. So I'm going to go back a tiny bit before we go forward about exiling authenticity in favor of attachment.
Wow.
So let's say that like a child is at a very young age is being really playful and silly with their parent who's working from home. I know a lot of us had this experience during the pandemic. And this behavior is met with being ignored, no eye contact, exasperation. Alternatively, when the child is playing quietly with their toys, they hear, "Look at you being so good for mommy while she's working." The messaging this child is receiving is, "My attachment is more secure when I'm being serious and not bothering mommy. And mommy doesn't like when I'm silly." So ultimately, with repetition, this child exiles their silliness and turns up the behavior of being pleasing, in this case, being more independent and not being too much. So, through an IFS lens, we're going to have a people pleasing manager show up in therapy with the burden of, "I'm too much." So, I think that that's one way that we can conceptualize it in the therapy room. Another way is to think about these formation of parts through the lens of considering how my primary attachment figure responds to me having a want or a desire. So when I'm a baby and I'm hungry, I cry. I don't consider if it's an inconvenience or if it's a good time for me to cry. I have hunger and I'm crying.
Yeah.
And adjusted environment, a caregiver is going to respond to that, and the baby makes the connection. If I'm hungry, I cry, I'm attended to. My
Yeah.
caregiver comes to me and my needs are met.
Yeah.
So in this case, the baby is learning I'm allowed to have this want and desire to be fed, and I will be responded to and comforted if I cry. So there's an expected outcome of safety and connection when I have a want, and that's ideal. Okay, but alternatively, let's look at another example around feeding. Let's say a child is repeatedly scolded and shamed for wanting candy, and they articulate a want or a desire of, "Oh, I really want a piece of candy." And they are met with, "You always want candy. Candy is bad for you. You need to want more nutritious food. Stop asking us for candy." how does this child respond to this? Like, it's quite possible that over time, the child starts to internalize that it is shameful to want. It's shameful to want candy. It's shameful to want toys, like whatever the want is. So they exile the authentic parts of themselves that want something that their parents don't agree with in favor of that attachment. And they still authentically want these things, but now it's met with criticism and shame, and they've assigned moral meaning to wanting that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting to think about because I work with a lot of folks that dealt with a lot of complex trauma that was oftentimes persistent through childhood and adolescence, sometimes into adulthood. And one of the things that the conversation is people who have certainly had to prioritize their attachment over their authenticity, they don't know they don't know a lot about who they are. A lot of their experience of self comes from almost say looking out the window instead of looking in the mirror. They're constantly scanning other people's emotional signs and trying to anticipate what they want or expect from them and trying to, again, for that proximity, for that to stay connected, to avoid rejection, punishment, criticism. And then when we are having these conversations about connecting with self, a lot of people don't know because they haven't been living in that exploration of authenticity for years and years, often decades, and they don't even know how to start that process.
Oh my gosh, Shayna, we could nerd out on this for so long. We definitely do not move this time. Yeah, it's okay. So this is what I want to say about that because yes, that happens in complex trauma, but that happens in everyday life as well. And so the first thing I want to say is that in terms of regulation is caught, not taught. So
Mm.
I absorb my ability to regulate by what my parents have to offer. And my parents did not grow up with Dr. Becky on Instagram. Like they were doing the best they could with what they had. And I love them for that. But so if something wasn't available to them, and they have their own stuff, their own legacy burdens, their own things coming up that in therapy wasn't super popular back in the 80s and 90s. It was very stigmatized. Okay, but I don't want to go off on that tangent because I want to try and stick to my point. I'm struggling. Okay, so emotion regulation is caught, not taught. So let's say that you're in a family where adults have never really prioritized talking about difficult topics. That, like something on the news, like something that's happening in politics. So a child is aware, they're very sensitive, they're very aware that something's not quite right in the environment. They're like, okay, mom and dad seem stressed, but no one's saying anything. Or let's say that there's a sick grandparent and mom and dad look really upset or stressed out. Mom, dad, what's wrong? Oh, nothing, honey, nothing. Like they don't know how to have that conversation. So what is internalized from that child is, huh, something feels different, but I'm asking mom and dad about it. And they're saying that nothing is going on. I must not be able to trust myself. I must be getting it wrong. So that creates the exact dynamic that you're talking about where I don't get things right. When I ask mom and dad, when I notice something, they're telling me that I'm wrong. That's what they're internalizing. And that is going to lead to that dynamic you're talking about where people don't know who they are because they haven't trusted themselves. I can't trust myself. I get things wrong.
Yeah.
So isn't it interesting to think about?
Yeah. And I have so many folks, myself included, at many points in my life where a reliance on things like reassurance seeking because there's such a inability to self-validate. There is such a doubt about that my perception of experiences must be wrong, my emotional reaction must be either incorrect, the offset, or out of proportion in terms of intensity or something like that. But yeah, I can see how all of those things come to be. How would you describe how attachment styles show up in present day relationships? What do you notice there?
Oh my goodness. Okay. Can I give you one more example of how it's going to show up in the therapy room before we go into that? Because I think that this is really helpful. And so you would ask me, how do attachment themes show up through like protectors, managers, and exiled parts? And I will tell you, like, one of the most prevalent systems that I work with, and I don't know if just like attracts or like the universe just brings these. I'm trying not to be agendaed about it, but it's just what I see. It's around helpfulness and the inability to express needs or be problematic. And the burden of the exile is always more often than not some sort of flavor of I don't matter. And so the sneaky thing about this constellation of parts is it can be at and it can this is what we were just talking about. It can be adaptations in a family system where there's still plenty of love, beautiful relationships, and encouragement. And so many initial offerings of these parts being adaptations from childhood are rejected because they're like, no, I had a great childhood. But as human beings, we all have the experience of coming into this world as a baby and having a relationship with some type of caregiver. So we all experience adaptations for attachment. And the most familiar story I hear coming in is something around some type of experience taking attention away from a child. And it could be anything. There's a lot of assumptions made around that it must have, and I don't, it's therapists tend to think that it's something traumatic, but it could be any.
A sibling being born, I see, is one that's commonly, yeah, it's a
Exactly.
threat that's not traumatic. It's just a shift, a
Exactly.
transition. Yeah.
100%. Yeah. So I'm like, my offering is that life is traumatic
Right.
or and that our survival is dependent on attachment, then adaptations for attachment are pretty traumatic. Back to that presentation, exactly. Like someone, like a baby is born, there's a sick family member, a sick sibling, a high stress job, a divorce, a mental health issue, a big move, like anything. And it could be, of course, something more traumatic, but that it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. Or benign neglect, I think, is a really big one. And that was my situation where, oh, Alyce seems like a good kid. She doesn't seem like she needs a lot of heavy parenting. So we're going to give her space to make choices. I wasn't ready for that. Anyway, I digress.
I never heard of that term. That's really interesting. The benign neglect, this idea that the assumption of readiness for independence and maybe like a backing away that's taken to too much of an extreme of that sort of how you were
Absolutely.
conceptualizing it. Yeah.
Absolutely. We just heard this past summer, like this idea of bringing back the feral summer, which I believe if you grew up in the 90s, you had a feral summer,
Yeah, of
right?
course.
But that, as beautiful as that is, and how boredom fosters creativity, and there's all these things that can come from having a little bit more room to express yourself without your parents being right on top of you. At the end of the day, benign neglect, it can lead to this internalized belief of there's something else that is taking precedence over my parents paying attention to me. And I know this sounds dramatic, but it's like, I must not matter. But it's
Mhm.
not like I don't matter. Oh, I don't matter. It's more like they have other things they need to attend to. They need to attend to my sister who's struggling at school. They need to attend to my brother who's having a difficult time with his behavior. I can be the good one. I can be the helpful one and not be a problem. That right there is a beautiful opportunity for our protectors to take shape. Be helpful. Don't be a problem. There's not room for you. Your parents have too many other things going on. So this is what I see time and time again in the therapy room is the birth of these protectors moving into non-preferred roles based on a parent's capacity to pay attention. Because there is a finite amount of attention. Like we can't argue with that. But it's what is the moral meaning I assign to something else needing that attention over me?
Yeah. No, absolutely. That's a helpful distinction.
Yes. And then there's also the burden of responsibility with these protective parts. So I am responsible for maintaining this status quo. So I'm not a problem. Otherwise, I'm problematic. If I'm perfect, I'm valuable. If I don't have needs, I'm not a burden on my parents. If I work hard enough, I'm important. And all of these parts have a fear around what their value will be if those protectors don't do their job. And again, it kind of funnels down to this vulnerable exile of I don't matter as much as these other things.
Yeah.
Okay, I would like now to answer how do you describe attachment styles in present day relationships? I think this is really interesting. And again, all of these topics like parenting through an IFS lens, all of these things could be their own separate podcasts. But I know a lot of people hear attachment and they think of those popular like securely attached, avoidant, anxious attached. And in IFS, the way we conceptualize attachment styles, and I learned this from Frank Anderson, and I agree 100%, is we are not one attachment style. we have the propensity to be like all the different attachment styles. And there's something in IFS that we say that parts beget parts. So what part of me attaches to what part in another person's system?
Yeah.
So yeah, did that make sense?
Yeah, because I think we don't talk enough about, we talk about our attachment style sometimes as the static thing rather than that relationships happen in the dyads, right? So I don't know how to say it without saying relationship. It's a relationship between two people. You're not attaching to a wall or you're attaching to an inanimate object. You're talking to the fluidity and unpredictability sometimes of another human being. So I think it's probably a very responsive, ongoing process versus a fixed date.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's so dynamic. And I think that something that they say in IFS, I think I already said it, but I want to just name it one more time, is parts beget parts. And it took me about 3 years to figure out exactly what that meant. So if anyone is where I was, because I can't be the only one, I just want to like quickly explain when we say parts beget parts, we're saying a part of me calls out a part of you. Like earlier, when I was telling you how my mind works really fast, and maybe I do have a diagnosis of ADHD, how I can start with a new sentence before finishing you were like, preach, girl. Another part of you felt witnessed, felt seen. And so that part of me called out that part of you.
Yeah.
And again, this is not about moral meaning. It's not that a good part of me brings out a good part of you or a bad part of me brings out a good part of you. It's parts bring about parts. There's no moral meaning assigned to it. And based on our adaptations for attachment, we are going to find, that we have a response to the response that we developed in relationship to our attachment with our primary caregivers are going to respond to our future partners' parts or our friends' parts or the people that we're dating's parts. My business partner, when I'm overwhelmed, she has a helper part that wants to take something off of my plate. I perceive that as her not thinking that I'm capable, and she's perceiving it as I want to be helpful to you. So you don't know how our parts bring about other parts, but we do know that parts bring about other parts. And the complement of that is self begets self. So when I'm in self energy, I am calling out to your self energy. So that is contagious. So I just wanted to explain that because, again, took me years to understand that. And I just want to offer that to people. But how this impacts our relationships, I have my husband's permission to share this example. And when I was telling him, like, hey, is this okay to share on the podcast? And as I was walking through it with him, he goes, yes, that is exactly what happened. So he felt very witnessed. So I have, based on like my upbringing, I have legacy burdens in my family around worrying. I was an anxious child. I'm also genetically more highly sensitive. Like that is a genetic trait, being sensitive. And I remember that I used to wait at the window for my mom to come home. Like I was worried about her. And I had this sense of responsibility that I wanted to watch for her, make sure she got home safely, educate her in the 90s, has her little planning groups that meet late at night. As an adult, I would say that I had a very prevalent anxious part when I was getting to know people in the setting of a new relationship. And oftentimes that worked against my favor because I was so anxious, like maybe there was capacity for a relationship to move to the next level, but I was doubting it so much and like reassurance seeking so much that it brought out a part of them that was like, I'm overwhelmed, like I need to stop this. Okay, so cue my husband. He comes into the relationship and I'm like, this guy is securely attached. He does not trigger that insecure attachment in me, that part of me that feels really anxious. I was like, he must have secure attachment. And I start like those parts of me aren't activated. And so I start being able to do this internal work and I start healing from some of these. I'm getting into IFS work. I'm starting to get to know these parts more, like getting into a self-to-part relationship. And as a byproduct of that is I become more independent in the relationship because I'm not triggered by him pulling away because he doesn't pull away. Okay, then this sneaky thing happened where I become more independent. And so he starts to become more anxious. I feel like you're not there, like you're in your own little world. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like when did you become so emotional? Like my parts are like responding to this. Oh my gosh, what is going on? Not like, ew, but just I actually got angry. I was like, why are you acting like this? Like, where does this come from? I'm helping people all day and then you're needing something from me, like reassurance. Like, it was just, it brought out this different part of me. Then I read that book, You Are the One You've Been Waiting For, which I told you I'm just obsessed with, by Richard Schwartz. And I realized that I was angry at my partner because my exiles still felt abandoned by him when he moved into this needier place. Like,
Oh,
I had this expectation that he was always going to be strong and steady. And when he moved into this place of needing more from me, I got angry about it. And once I had that moment of clarity, sorry, that's my reminder to do a mini unblend every hour. But once I had that clarity of what was happening in our relationship dynamic, I had an almost instantaneous transformation. I felt all of a sudden I was like, "Oh, I can be with those parts of me that felt abandoned." Like, I still had parts that were expecting him to be the primary caretaker of my exiles. So that is a I think that's a beautiful example of how parts beget parts and attachment styles are dynamic, to your point. It's not like this static thing that can never change. So that was my long-winded way of answering your question. And there are so many other examples that we could talk out, but I
yeah.
think that one is really helpful.
And it also just brings me back to what you've mentioned a few times, and I think it's really worth repeating is these sort of like the call for proximity is neither good or bad, and that there is no morality to it, but then we as humans assign this moral meaning. So
Yeah.
any recognizing that any of these sort of behaviors out of context are not neither good or bad is really assessing within the context of any given moment the workability of any of these sort of ways of connecting, showing up, etc. And I think that that's important to also think about as therapists because we have to recognize the limitations within our own system and model, which is we work within a medicalized system that's based on this idea of pathology. So we oftentimes, out of context, look at certain behaviors as inherently good or bad, or these are symptoms you have to eliminate or reduce. My hope of where mental health is moving about depathologizing and like moving more to curiosity about the function of behaviors and the function of attachment styles and then giving people the tools to be flexible so they don't get static and rigid and can't evolve and move around different relationships and roles and contexts and all of those things.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And I almost just I think I might have just had a moment of clarity that it's like the moral meaning assigned by protector is the fear of the protector. What does this say about me? Oh my gosh, thank you, Shayna, for inspiring that moment of clarity in my heart.
Well, you had that unblended moment. So not fancy out there.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and that's what I love about the IFS model is it's not about like good, bad. What does this mean that you have? And I know some people really identify with a label, having a set of symptoms that fits. Everyone wants to be understood, right? We all want to be witnessed and understood. But at the same time, I love just offering this reframe as whatever the part's doing, whatever the verb is, that is the strategy that part uses to protect you. So even like a part that's incredibly critical, that has absorbed that ability to criticize for regulation, for the service of regulation from a parent, a critical parent, that part uses criticism as a strategy to protect you. And so I'm always offering back this reframe of, wow. And I think that being able to offer that back creates this micro unblend where it's, oh, okay, that part does have good intentions. And then the more we differentiate, the more we're able to bring self energy, like a differentiation, a byproduct of differentiation is more access to self energy. So, yes, these are all I know we're getting off topic here, but I think it's all relevant. We have so much content here, Shayna. What are we going to do with this? Okay.
Absolutely. So, do you draw inspiration from other attachment-based or relational models, or do you tend to integrate attachment more intuitively through IFS itself?
I think it really does feel more intuitive to me. Obviously, I've learned so much from Frank Anderson, Gabor Mate, and Dr. Becky Kennedy around just information about attachment, like them being able to talk about the information in a digestible way But it's been this journey of here, all of these kind of moments of clarity I had as a therapist, being able to go back and conceptualize them through an IFS lens has been so incredibly helpful. So I would say that like IFS has been the tie that binds everything together and gives me this clear way of conceptualization.
So, what are some of your go-to interventions or rental exercise that help clients begin to develop an internal secure attachment between their self and their parts?
Yes, beautiful question. And I want to go back to something I said earlier about how that book, You Are the One You've Been Waiting For, really helped me recognize that my ultimate goal, however, in whatever way it takes, however length of time it takes, is I want self energy to be my secure internal attachment figure, like the leader of my parts, like the ones that my parts are attaching to instead of something outside of myself. So I really take my time with the self to part relationship. I really take my time making like noticing what I did with you earlier. I'm like, oh, I just want to notice that clarity. Like I am always doing that with my clients. Dan Siegel says he says so much about attention, but the three things that I really hold on to is the only thing we have control over is what we pay attention to. Attention is relational, for better or for worse. Attention is relational. And where attention goes, energy flows.
Yeah.
So the more often I can help you reflect and note, and now here we have Gabor Mate. He says, noticing is an act of compassion. Notice when they're in self energy, we're sending more energy to this like recognition of self. And then in IFS, we move to the idea is that we want to help our clients get into a relationship between their self energy and their parts. And we do that through the 6 Fs. And I really take my time. Really, I do not rush that. I call it languishing in the self to part relationship. So I'm really going to, once I get to that question of how do you feel towards that part, and we're looking for a quality of self energy, like one of the 8 Cs or something similar. Once they have that feeling towards the part, I'm really going to encourage to stay there until the part can receive that quality. So if they're saying, "Oh, I'm feeling really compassionate towards that part," my next question is, does that part sense that compassion? Really invite that part to take you in. Really invite that part to see you. Does it know who you are? Does it know how old you are? That you're a well-resourced adult at this point, that you're not a little kid anymore. So there's a lot of updating, like titrating these little prediction errors, which is from predictive processing, which we could nerd out on as well. But just like really taking the time, this is what leads to neuroplasticity, like the brain developing more flexibility. This is the neuroscience of why IFS works, is we're titrating that experience of, oh, I didn't know you were there. I didn't know you were an adult. I didn't know that you were a therapist. And how does that part respond to that? So I'm really going to hang out in that self to part relationship. And for the clients who are like, I have no idea who that part is, we are not going to rush anything. We go slow to go fast. Okay. So if a part responds to that invitation to really take self in with any sort of distrust or anger, then we're going to hang out there and we're going to, number one, if it's necessary, maybe self is going to offer a repair attempt. If this part's like, where have you been? It's like, you're right. I haven't been there and I'm here now and I'm not going anywhere. Or that's always, or the next question, if there's a little bit of rejection, which again is like this, maybe this reenactment from their attachment, their parts that have developed and due to attachment, this self is going to say, what is it going to take for you to trust that I'm not going anywhere? And they always say something along the lines of show up, be consistent, don't go anywhere. And this is what babies are wanting for their primary caregivers, right? Their primary attachment figures. And self has the capacity to hear all that, to take it in, and to say, yes, absolutely. Self does not have any ill will towards a part being like, I don't know where you've been. Why should I trust you? Self is, yes, I received that. And what would it take for you to be able to trust me? I'm not going anywhere. I call this a super C. I call this capacity. I have a couple of super C's that I think about, and it's like a C word that's several C words blended together. Capacity is confidence, courage, compassion. So when I show up with all of those things on board, then we can help those clients that struggle to develop that self-to-part relationship. So that is the most important thing, is establishing a good, first of all, helping. So this is, I'm going to tie it all together in your question, helping the client know what their self energy feels like by noticing it and helping them get into relationship with it. And then helping get really being present as they create that self to part relationship and languishing in that self to part relationship.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I always find it important because like whenever I start, I have so much curiosity about IFS, but I'm really coming in as a true beginner. But as an ACT therapist, I really do see all of these synergies and overlaps. But I love the language of IFS because I feel like some of these very like heady kind of like concepts like self as context and content are given into a more intuitive languaging through IFS. As you were talking through that, there's a concept in ACT of a fusion that we get fused with self narratives, we get fused with beliefs about ourselves or ways that we expect, like this like narrowing of our behavioral repertoire where we only assume that we will react and have the capacity in certain ways in certain in contexts. I think that idea of like to me, this is just like a beautiful process of diffusion. And I know you're talking about through this language of unblending, but I think we can start to really know ourselves through our parts and say, oh, my identity is, oh, I'm the overworker, or I'm the people pleaser. And uh, I like that being in relationship component and almost seeing that self energy as this secure attachment figure. It really does blend these two concepts really beautifully.
Absolutely. And Shayna, I love that you said fusion. Isn't fuse, or you talked about fuse, that's the same thing as being blended, right? It's just
Right.
being like that part being fully in the driver's seat.
Yes.
And my hot take is that all of these therapies are about mindfulness. Whatever entry point resonates with you, if it's ACT or somatic experiencing, EMDR, there's all of these ways are working towards differentiating that I have this calm, safe, connected space in my nervous system. And when I can get curious about those aspects of myself from this calm, connected place, then I can develop flexibility. So I love the language around IFS, but whatever language is feels accessible for people, you could definitely see the overlap in all these models.
Absolutely. So, what are some mistakes or misunderstandings you see when clinicians are trying to integrate some of these approaches? I just saw actually a really, I don't know, I was really quite surprised. I felt like a little bit of a hit piece on IFS about almost that IFS almost
Therapies up and break you.
it can break you, and almost that it, like the accusation, it was exacerbating dissociation and fragmentation and things like that, which just because of my entry into it with it has just not been my understanding or experience at all. So I was just
Right.
curious, maybe your thoughts and your take on that.
Absolutely, absolutely, Shayna. I so appreciate you bringing that up. It was a very provocative article. That picture, my goodness. And I saw that and immediately I was like, this doesn't resonate with IFS, but I understand that there are people in a much different place than I am that could see that and be like, oh my gosh, what are we doing here? And I think Rivka Eldry had the most beautiful response. And just to summarize what she said, is that article really confused the misuse of IFS with the model itself. True IFS is gentle, consent based, always paced by the client system, and we never force memories or parts work. And when harm happens, that's a violation of IFS, not an example of it. The vast majority of our clients experience IFS as deeply healing, and the Institute has clear ethical standards to protect that. But like any powerful tool, it depends on the skill and integrity of the practitioner. not the model itself. I really think that article had a skewed explanation of IFS, and I do love that you brought that up. Again, I love what Rivka Eldry had said about it, so I'm so glad you brought that up. Now, to answer your question about the misuse or how maybe someone could go about this in a way that wouldn't be as respectful to a client is number 1, moving too fast. Number 2, assuming that they're looking for some big T or little T experience around trauma, neglect, abuse. We all have the experience of attaching to a primary caregiver, whoever it is. And so we all have the capacity to have these adaptations for attachment. So really slowing things down and getting curious about what was it like? Like, what do you remember? What do you remember about how you number 1, how you were parented? And again, considering that a lot of this stuff happens at 0 to 3 years old, where we may not have memories, but a great window is how do I respond to my kids? Because I'm going to want to shut down behaviors that I wasn't allowed to have. That's a great teacher on what our 0 to 3 was like. Another hot take I have is to watch your parents with your kids. When your kids start getting rowdy, a little rambunctious, how do your parents respond? I think that those are ways to understand maybe what my childhood would have looked like without having like hard evidence to support that. And then the other thing I want to offer is I think sometimes we get really hung up on parts that look like self energy, but they're actually, we call them self like parts or self adjacent parts. And there's nothing wrong with those parts. But typically, we find that they have this energy around really wanting to nurture, take care of, fix things for our young, vulnerable parts. So I always invite clinicians to really pay attention to, has the part been fully witnessed before a strategy is offered? So if they just go in right away and say, I want to get that part out of there, okay, let's consider that might be a part with an agenda instead of wanting to fully witness this part and see what this part needed to happen before offering a solution. So being intentional about really hearing from the parts, slowing things down, and understanding where the call comes from, as Kendall Hart says. Does the call come from inside the house or who's offering the strategy? So
Yeah. I love that too, because I do think one of the tricky things is that sort of tension between that so much of who we are does happen in this period where we don't have access to conscious memory. And as people that move through the world, assigning meaning, assigning moral meaning and otherwise to things, then living with this reality that so much of the foundational ways that our model of self, our model of other people, our general feelings of safety in the world are oftentimes formed in ways that we will not have that access to in this tangible way, where I could talk about an interaction with my husband last week and narrate to you what it meant and why it meant that and all of these things, particularly for us who are really in this like talk therapy space. So I really do think this model and giving access to that is so pivotal, because I think we all want to understand ourselves better. And I think shame reduces in the spaces where even if we can recognize maybe ways that we're showing up in the world or treating ourselves are no longer workable or serving us, that when I think for me, it feels very relieving to be like, oh, okay, but I get it. It unlocks the shame and takes out of that sort of maybe like moral interpretation that, oh, something's just like dysfunctional about me or inherently wrong with me or I'm bad or I'm unworthy. So I think that this also serves that of like attending to a curiosity about self in a very inherently compassionate way.
absolutely. And Dr. Becky, I love how she says, I was born in 1984, you're using 1984 lessons in 2025 and updating your manual. Oh, that's actually not necessary anymore. The conditions have changed. The stakes aren't that high anymore. I am surviving. I have a different relationship with my parents today. Yes. And the other last thing I want to add is that not everything is a part in a non-preferred role. And so not everything has to be something that needs to be changed or updated. I think about myself. I know that my parents really delighted in me being funny. And I love that about myself. I think I'm funny. And so that's a part that has a lot of self-energy on board. It's not a non-preferred role. So just also offering that not every aspect of ourself is a part in a non-preferred role. but just really finding out what is this part afraid would happen if I didn't do my job could be a good indicator of if that part is in a preferred role or a non-preferred role.
Yeah, I think that unlocked a lot for me as well, because I think almost like it, in some ways, if you're really coming again in without brand new eyes to this and you're very beginner, I almost feel like parts are synonymous with like defenses. And it sounds like it's more nuanced than that. And that protective role often maybe even like leads to authenticity and helps us with self-expression in many ways.
So beautiful. Yeah. Yeah, honestly.
So maybe just we can end with, is there any sort of core takeaway you'd like our listeners to get that maybe we haven't covered or you'd want to just reiterate for folks?
Yeah, just that. And I feel like I've mentioned this a couple of times throughout while we've been talking, just really understanding that this is a very human experience to develop adaptations around attachment. And again, just really driving it home. It's not about morality. It's about our brains are designed to keep us alive, right? And so we do that by developing these adaptations, these models around what keeps me alive. I think that's my biggest takeaway, that we all experience this and it's something to absolutely be curious about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for being on. I loved our conversation. Please come back anytime. I feel like I could talk about just a million different directions with this with you. I'm so excited for your training with the firm. We're just thrilled to get that information out there. Can you share folks where they can find you, where they connect with you, learn more from you about all the great things you have to offer?
Absolutely, absolutely. I have my website, alycemesser.com, which will be in the show notes that people can see all the offerings I have. And then again, I assist Kendall Hart. Christy Boggs and I assist Kendall Hart on a lot of her trainings. The three of us host therapist IFS EMDR retreats. We have 2 coming up in San Diego. It's like an IFS intensive. It is so incredible. We're so proud of it. I'm developing a training for attachment. So if people are interested in that, like IFS in it through an attachment lens, if people want to be informed about that, they could absolutely sign up for my newsletter. Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining our community on the Affirming Minds podcast. If you loved this episode as much as we did, please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts and share it on your socials. If you want more information about how this podcast can add to your continuing education credits, visit affirmmentalhealth.com. And remember, let's affirm, heal, and grow together.